Hello, and welcome to the February 10th edition of Points of View. I'm your host, Lindsay Wilcox. Today, we'll be discussing the Arab Spring Egyptian uprisings with former U.S. Ambassador to Egypt and Tennessee native Margaret Scobie, who came to Vanderbilt last week. But first, as always, let's go through the news rundown. First, as a quick GOP update, then we'll talk about the uprising in Syria, followed by the ever-controversial contraceptive issue and $25 billion mortgage agreement. 7 primaries in, and Romney, Santorum, Gingrich, and Paul are still in the race. According to the New York Times, Romney is in the lead by 94 delegates, followed by Santorum with 71, Gingrich with 29, and Paul with 8. Keep in mind that these are soft totals, meaning that they included estimated delegates from Iowa, Colorado, Minnesota, states that have been non-binding caucuses that the delegates are not required to vote for the candidate assigned to them, but are unlikely to deviate. Santorum saw a sweep on Tuesday, winning all 3 of the day's primaries in Colorado, Minnesota, and Missouri, and is hoping to hold on that momentum going through Maine tomorrow. Since March, Syrian protesters have been demonstrating against the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, who's been in office for 12 years. Triggered specifically by the arrest of teenagers in the northern town of Dara for graffitiing and taken into custody in Damascus without any parental notification, the protests have grown significantly, and the crackdowns have become increasingly and horrifyingly bloody. Despite appeals from the world leaders to stop the crackdowns, the Syrian government killed dozens in Homs yesterday, with mortars and rockets that caused massive destruction. The UN, Western and Arab powers have all condemned Assad and called for his resignation, but will not resort to military intervention. The number of dead and wounded has exceeded the capacity of hospitals and rescue centers, causing the dying to do so in the streets. While countries such as Turkey and the U.S. consider ways to provide aid, Russia suggests that the issue is not one's but Syria's. Russia's interests lie in their traditional role in the Middle East, the market Syria provides for Russian arms, and their host of Soviet-era naval base. The overall death toll in Syria since last March is estimated at more than 5,000. President Obama's birth control policy stated that all employers should be required to provide their employees with health care plans that cover the contraception of birth control at no cost. Much to the changing of the GOP and some high-profile Catholic Democrats, since it would force religious-affiliated institutions like universities and hospitals to offer insurance coverage for contraception and other forms of birth control. The opponents call for softening or altogether abandonment of the rule. Those against it are taking to the issue very personally. Several members of the Congress feel as Speaker of the House, John Boehner, does, who calls it an attack of religious freedom in our country and vows to reverse it. In the opposite camp, the Public Religion Research Institute has found that 58% of Catholics actually agree with the policy, and support is fairly widespread amongst most groups. State and federal officials came to $25 billion mortgage agreement with the major banks involved in the housing collapse, though many will likely be disappointed by the terms. The 5 biggest home lenders have $72 billion of costs tied to the repurchases, litigation, foreclosures, and errors on faulty mortgages since 2008, with the Bank of America paying the most. The settlement puts power in the hands of investors who are entitled to ask for refunds for compensation if they find missing or inaccurate data on home values or borrowers' income. The agreement includes $1.5 billion payouts to about 750,000 borrowers who lost their homes to foreclosure, and $17 billion to pay for mortgage debt forgiveness, forbearance, short sales, and other assistance to homeowners. Finally, servicers will provide $3 billion in refining to lower homeowners' interest rates. The breakdown of company payment is as follows. Bank of America has committed to as much as $11.8 billion, Wells Fargo $5.35 billion, JP Morgan $5.29 billion, Citigroup $2.2 billion, and Ally $310 million. The litigation and liabilities are far from over, though. This only satisfies the state attorneys general, but does not provide immunity from securitizations. That's all for the news rundown today. Let's go over to Sid for some background from the former ambassador's talk and Egypt's place in the Arab Spring.
Thanks, Lindsay. Last week, former ambassador to Egypt, Margaret Scobie, spoke at Vanderbilt about Egypt and the Arab Spring. Now the deputy commandant and international affairs advisor at the National Defense University and a career foreign service officer, Scobie served in Egypt from 2008 to 2011. Prior to Egypt, she served as ambassador to Syria. On January 25, 2011, the Egyptian uprising began in a campaign of protests that toppled longtime Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak's oppressive regime. Most of the protesting was of the nonviolent civil resistance nature, though about 846 people have been killed to date. While there are many causes that contributed to the eventual tipping point, some of the main issues include police brutality, corruption, lack of free elections, and other basic rights, as well as widespread economic issues. In the beginning of Ambassador Scobie's talk, she discussed some of the historical context that led to increasing public discontent. Like several other Arab Spring nations, Egypt was experiencing a shrinking middle class with educated young people who were frustrated and able to mobilize without a defined leader. When Tunisian fruit vendor Mohamed Bouzizi set himself on fire in demonstration of the injustices by government officials, the stopper had to be pulled from several Middle Eastern populations, and the protesting spilled out to be greeted by violent governmental crackdowns. In Egypt, as Ambassador Scobie explains, the authoritarian regime facilitated corruption, impeded growth, and undermined popular legitimacy. Though the economy and GDP were climbing until 2008, there existed a disconnect between those numbers and the steady decline of people who felt they were thriving in their own societies, according to a Gallup poll from 2005 to 2010. There was a great rise in the price of commodities, and while people weren't starving due to bread subsidies, staples like tomatoes were becoming out of reach for the middle class. Illegal strikes in Egyptian factories were becoming rampant, and inequality grew. Suddenly, people began to notice that only those close to the president's son were getting wealthy, and no one else seemed to have anything. Eventually, economic and political grievances became mixed, and it was fatal for the regime, and many felt for the Tunisian fruit vendor who encapsulated their frustrations. Let's check in with Kyle Blaine, who attended the talk, to hear some of his reactions to the ambassador's thoughts. Hello, Kyle. Thanks for joining us.
No problem.
To start, let's look at a clip in which Ambassador Scobie shares her thoughts on the factors that lent themselves to the eventual Egyptian uprising.
I don't really think I have a great explanation for why now. Some things in Egypt, I think, help set the stage. The issue of presidential succession had been an issue for several years. Finally, in the last few months of the 2010, you could hear some very senior people saying, well, probably Mubarak will run again. We would all be happy if he would run again. So the thought of an 84-year-old man running for his six-year term of office, I think people are just desperate. This is a country of 82 million people. It needs energetic leadership, and that was not an option in what they were seeing and hearing from the regime at that time. Some have said this was an internet revolution, a social media revolution, but it certainly did facilitate communication and organization among this very leaderless but like-minded group of people who were determined to bring the regime to account starting on January the 25th. I'm not sure I actually know why in 2011 this happened. Again, the spark in Tunis is certainly the one factor we all know did happen then and did have an impact. The tinder was dry, the flame took, and we are now watching the results of this.
Do you agree with Ambassador Scobie? Do you feel there were other factors that set the stage?
I think the factors that she pointed out were correct, but a little obvious. I think the things that she didn't really point out is that this wasn't a universal protest, that there are a lot of disagreements within the protest movement about the direction of the country, and we're starting to see that kind of play out now in the elections.
Do you have a guess as to why now?
She said that she wasn't really sure, but I think that what happened in Tunis, the overall uprisings in the Middle East right now, they have sort of a demonstration effect. And in political science, what that is when you see a neighboring country have a successful revolution or make a successful movement, that the process for which that occurred starts to duplicate itself in neighboring countries where similar problems exist. And I think you're starting to see that now.
Okay. As most of our viewers know, the Arab Spring encompasses the uprisings in Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, and others, and Ambassador Scobie here speaks about them collectively.
But citizens all over the place have been sort of demanding change from their government. And one thing that is absolutely, I'm convinced, is one of the common threads. These are all indigenous and spontaneous. This is not something that any outside party has been manipulating. And they are all each unique. They all have their own history. They all have their own momentum. And they may not all be going in exactly the same direction. But I do know that economic issues and the desire for human dignity and social justice is a huge factor in what brought people out.
Do you think that the others would have happened if it weren't for the Tunisian fruit vendor? If they're all unique, how come they all happen in such rapid succession?
Well, as I was getting at before, I think that the fruit vendor did play an important role. When you have that sort of movement and successful results from a movement, they start to duplicate itself. And she hints at it a little bit in terms of social media and the internet, really making it easy for that sort of movement to duplicate itself in different countries. And I think that's what you see happening in the Middle East.
She says that all of these citizens want dignity and social justice, and earlier you said these are great challenges for any elected government to produce. How do you do that?
I think that the loudest voices within these protest movements were definitely the younger generation, and they do want dignity and social justice. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with democratic elections, which is what these liberal groups wanted, you have those conservative, a little bit more silent voices, but very conservative voices that are coming through, and human dignity and social justice in a religious conservative environment isn't necessarily a top priority. And so I think you're going to see a lot of conflicts going forward in these elected governments about this issue.
Definitely, definitely. The ambassador is in a really interesting position to talk about America's role in all of this. Let's hear what she has to say on that.
But the question remains, what do we do? Do we have a role to play? As I said, I will repeat, these revolutions are not ours. They are not by us or for us or against us, but the outcome is, of course, important to us. The President last May was very unambiguous. He said the U.S. opposes the use of violence and repression against the people of the region. We support a universal set of rights, including free speech, free assembly, and association, equality for men and women under the rule of law, the right of religious freedom without fear of violence or discrimination, the right to choose your own leaders through democratic elections. And we support political and economic change in the Middle East and North Africa that can meet the legitimate aspirations of the people throughout the region. Again, Secretary Clinton made clear in a speech last December that our promotion of democracy and human rights reflects our values as part of our ideals. But we now know and understand even more fully, perhaps than before, that the absence of these elements undermines our interests and contribute to instability. So we promote this not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is, because it's a smart thing to do, and as we assess our interests in the region, we have to do this. We will continue and do to support civil society and the independence of NGOs, despite pushback from some who either don't understand what we're doing or are trying to keep civil society suppressed in their countries. We do not fund political parties, but we offer training. We support electoral reform. We want to help citizen groups develop their own skills to hold their governments accountable. We'll continue to speak publicly and privately about the importance and urgency of reform. Countries are different. Our policy is to support democratic reform both as a principle but also as a practical requirement. We will not ignore or abandon the pursuit of our complex interests and the need for cooperation with historic partners, even as we continue to press them to accelerate their own efforts to respond to their own people's demands. Where partners are moving slowly, we will urge them to move faster. We also understand that economic growth and the creation of real economic opportunity serves the interests of democratic reform, and we think we have a lot to offer here. In Egypt, for example, we've offered a plan to convert some debt to the U.S. Into funding for local development projects. OPIC has set aside quite a bit of money for Egypt and the region. We're working with the international financial institutions to fashion the type of support needed in the short term. And we will work to integrate these countries both regionally and globally into more constructive trading patterns.
This has been a controversial issue since America became a superpower. What's our role in the global community, and where do we draw that line of influence?
I think you saw Barack Obama's administration really struggling with this in terms of the Egyptian revolution. Mubarak had been a close ally of ours for a long time, an economic ally, and also an ally in the Middle East when it comes to the topic of Israel, and an important strategic ally. I think after you had 8 years of the Bush administration, which really redefined America's role in the world in terms of what we could do in the world and in terms of preemptive combat, you have a foreign policy now that's really struggling with this. I don't think you got a clear foreign policy out of the Barack Obama administration dealing with how to deal with this issue, and you're starting to kind of see that come through, and Scobie did not really get at the heart of this.
Do you think that the Egyptians want our help? We've had problems with that in other campaigns throughout our history as well.
I think if you ask any person who's an expert in the Middle East, they will tell you that Egyptian people will say, we love Americans, we hate your government. The United States was seen really as propping up the Mubarak regime to a lot of these Egyptians. And actually in Tahrir Square, you saw a lot of anti-American, anti-Zionism sentiment coming through on the celebrations. So I think American involvement has to be limited by the reality of the situation and by the sentiment of the people.
Oh, no, that sounds great. One more question for you. Can we even afford to be this involved, especially with converting Egyptian debt? What's the cost-benefit ratio like?
I think that in terms of money, it's hard to apply that to foreign affairs because you always have to look at how great of a benefit and what is in our interests in the Middle East, specifically Egypt. I don't think you can put a price tag on what it's going to mean to have Egyptians hold up their non-hostility pact towards Israel. That's not really a cost you can associate. You could say it is invaluable to us. So
definitely. Let's take a look at our next clip.
I think the challenges and opportunities here are historic. They are transformative, even though we can't predict the outcomes. It will take a number of years for these countries to sort out who's going to be holding power, how they're going to share power. They are facing very complex problems. Not every decision or policy may make us happy, but I think they deserve time to make their own mistakes and to rectify them.
Is this what we're really doing? Before, Scobie listed some of the ways we're heavily invested and involved. Does our involvement even prevent such countries from making their own mistakes?
Mistakes, she says that yes. She says that mistakes are going to be made in this country. I think that the real fear we're getting into, though, is that the United States has committed itself to these universal set of principles, which are really, in the grand scheme of things, these grand liberal principles of basic human rights, female rights, minority rights, and the issue is that what you have going on in Egypt right now is these strong conservative voices coming through in democratic elections. You have the Muslim Brotherhood sweep parliamentary elections. So it's going to be very difficult for the United States to maintain these principles and applying them to Middle Eastern countries when you really do have a strong Islamic movement going on in Egypt right now, which in a Western view is hostile towards women and hostile towards sexual and religious minorities.
And finally, Kyle, you asked the ambassador the following question. Quote, can you give an assessment of U.S. policy towards Syria? And based on that, do you feel that we're vulnerable to international opinion for not taking a stronger stance against Syria? End quote. Here was her answer.
Our stand on Syria has been very strong for a long period of time. When we began to see violations, as he said, we've always known these are not our uprisings. We are not directing these. We have to be guided by what the people are saying. And from the get-go, we have called upon the Syrian authorities very, very publicly to respect the right of peaceful protest and demonstration, and condemned and criticized repeatedly this. And what we have done, I mean, we already had a very minimal, maybe not even minimal by this time, contact with them in terms of any kind of economic or other relationship. We have sanctions on Syria that date back to, I think, 2004. And we have worked very hard in the international community to crank those sanctions up, not only our own, but with other Europeans and others, and you now have the Arab League leading the charge. So I think the United States very much believes that the way, not every situation is the same. What happened in Libya is not what has happened exactly in Syria. And right now you see very strong efforts in New York, with the Secretary herself up there, trying to get the Security Council to endorse a proposal that would ask Bashar al-Assad to step aside and allow a process of political negotiation and reform to take place. So I think we believe we are very much in support of what people are demanding there. We've said Bashar should leave, but not every case will automatically end in a military intervention. The Secretary said that just the other day. And the people of Syria haven't necessarily asked for this either.
So she seems to say that our position has been clear and strong, but minimalistic. What do you think of her answer, and how do the examples of U.S. policy relate to what you're asking?
Listen, she was right in saying that U.S. policy has always been very strict towards Syria and that they're doing the best they can do within their constraints. Unfortunately, what you're seeing now, and as recently as this week, is the Syria situation is intensifying severely. And the United States is going to be left with no option other than to have some sort of severe diplomatic or actual military intervention. And I think that unfortunately, in the early stages of this, there were steps not taken that could have been taken to prevent this situation from escalating. Now we're in a position where the situation has escalated and our policy positions are becoming more narrower, and they're between do nothing and military intervention.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem, Sid.
That's all the time we have, and thanks for all of you watching for joining us as well, right here on Points of View.